The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to the Able to Care podcast. I am your host, Andy Baker, and joining me today is a very special guest, Dr. Jane Gilmour. So Dr. Jane Gilmour is a consultant clinical psychologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital and course director for postgraduate child development programs at University College London, where she lectures on neuropsychology, neurodevelopmental conditions, that takes some getting my lips around, including things like Tourette's, autism and OCD, and also therapeutic issues as well. She's published numerous academic articles and chapters on numerous topics. But the reason I've got Jane on today is some of you may recognize the name from a number of weeks ago. I did a review on one of Jane's books called How to Have Incredible Conversations with Your Child that she co-wrote with Dr. Bettina Honan. I believe is it Honan? Am I pronouncing that correctly, Jane?
Honan, she preferred.
Honan. Yeah, no problem at all. Which is, and obviously I've done the review on that particular book itself. That's not the only book you've written as well. You've also done one on the incredible teenage brain book that you also co-authored with Bettina, and it was somebody else as well. Who was the other author that you co-authored that one with?
And Tara Murphy.
Tara Murphy, fantastic. But I want to talk to you about this particular book because I think it was I really liked it. We've had a conversation before I then received the book and read through it and things like that. So it was a lovely resource that I will be recommending and pushing out there, definitely. But first off, thank you so much for joining me today.
Delighted to be here. Talking is one of my favourite pastimes, and I'm really grateful for the chance to think about incredible conversations. Absolutely delighted.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so obviously you've got a wealth of experience. Working at Great Ormond Street Hospital is I don't know, sounds like a quite a high accolade in my mind. As soon as I kind of read that, I was like, oh wow, that's quite impressive. What started you on your journey? How long have you been doing it? Tell me a little bit about your circumstances.
Well, it's interesting because I have been around Great Ormond Street Hospital and the Institute of Child Health, which is the academic side to the hospital, since I was an undergraduate. I happened to get a studentship when I was 19. That's a very long time ago. And so in one form or another, whether it's been as an academic, as a lecturer, or as a clinician, I've been attached to the hospital since then. And that tells you something about the wonderful experiences that it can offer. Obviously, there are children who are in very difficult circumstances by virtue of being in a centre like that. But there are lots of fantastic ways to develop one's thinking and one's clinical and academic skills. So I've never quite left it since I turned 19. But obviously what I'm doing now is very different from what I was doing then. And a lot of my work is really, whether that's a clinical intervention or whether that's about thinking about a group characteristic and so on. The first task we have as clinicians or as carers or, as professionals is trying to get to know the young people that we're working with. That's always job number one, no matter what our next task is. And that's kind of what brought me to this book, because I have been really, if I'm honest, developing this book really since I was in my early 20s. It's a resource that I've been using informally, one way or another. And that's really why it was such a passion project, because I really felt very strongly that lots of people, and, I'm hoping a lot of your audience members will really benefit from the use of the book, because it really is a kind of clinical friend, if you like, or a therapeutic friend, or a friend that you can have in the family in terms of the resource that it offers. Because really what I do when I go to meet a young person, particularly in the primary school years, is I wouldn't dream of going into a room without some paper and colouring pens. I consider that, I need my clinical background, but I also need my pens and paper. Now, one of the reasons for that, it's my toolkit, exactly. And one of the reasons for that, particularly in the primary school years, is, of course, we know that those young people are, in a phase of their cognitive development, which means they relate really well to concrete things rather than abstract concepts. And so drawing something to stand for, what I feel or, the mood I'm in is a really good way of landing with them. It's also, dare I say it, slightly less boring than one-to-one talking for many, many young people. So there's lots of ways to get creative. You can create any world you like on a piece of paper, and you can invite that young person to co-create, or even better, they can create it for you while you stand alongside. And so the idea of drawing as a way of augmenting a conversation really lies at the heart of this book.
That's really interesting. You kind of started with that point. I think with the conversations, I think the immediate instinct that most people have is, well, we have conversations all the time. We're talking all the time, so it's easy. But I think what you just mentioned there, as far as even the understanding the concepts or the way that children see the world, is that I think it's so easy as adults to forget. Well, we don't remember how we processed information when we were a child, how we understood language when we were a child. There's no way of kind of reversing time in our own heads to when we were at that point of how the world and conversations navigated. And that's, I think, so many parents, and I know I've definitely made the mistake myself with children within my world, where I've spoken from an adult point of view down to a child, kind of expecting them to understand in the same abstract way as you just mentioned there. And then it's kind of, there's an annoyance with them not understanding rather than an annoyance with me not knowing how to communicate effectively.
But I love the way you brought up the idea of time, because that's so important, particularly if we're thinking about young people who've been in the care system. The idea of having a conversation, it can be quite challenging for any young person, but something that has emotional content, particularly if we're thinking about the care experiences that some young people would have, might be really very difficult to manage. And when you're using drawing to help you convey ideas or help them convey ideas, you can stop it in time. You can put it away and, have a rest, go and have a snack, wait a week, wait 2 weeks and come back to it. And those ideas are still there, locked on the page, and you can bring them to life again when the time feels right. So there's lots of reasons why drawing is and this is not about being a great artist, it's just about having a way of using a concrete way of describing ideas that might normally, with adults in the room, might just, and I'm using just with inverted commas, I'm glad we're on video, as you can see that are just described in our auditory way. And you can start to, develop, using color, using different texture. I'll give you an example of one of the best ways I start. When I started to think about this book, I asked a young person who was really feeling very upset how they were feeling, and I put all the colors in front of me, and they picked up a handful of 5 or 6 colors and they scribbled on the page. You could not get a more beautifully articulated expression of how that young person felt. All the colors in a jumble, there you are. And it really made me start to think about the way we can use drawing. And, this book gives you lots of reasons and platforms, and is very well protected and supported if you're not into drawing, a way of showing you how you can use that. But drawing is a way into lots of young people, no matter what age they are, but particularly with this primary school age group. So it's really, I think probably, what's the expression, preaching to the converted, but I feel, you can tell, I feel very strongly about the power of the pen.
I think that's something that's appropriate for all ages as well. Or definitely, I think there's a mistake that many people make, especially when I'm teaching around children who are gone through difficult circumstances, that we have to kind of focus more on their developmental ages rather than necessarily their chronological age. So even though chronologically they may be, well, you're nearly a teenager now, you should be able to articulate and have concrete thinking and be able to formulate the words, but you may be communicating, especially when it comes down to the feelings, you may be communicating to definitely a much younger self, a much younger part of the developmental milestones. So I think that's something that, so when I read through it, I didn't feel this is just a book for primary age children. I felt this is a tool that any parent with any child, any age could potentially utilize.
And I do, I also am very interested in the teenage brain, as you know, from the books that Bettina Tarr and I have written. And I do use these platforms, these drawing platforms with young people up to, their 20s. The thing that I would change is possibly I would use a different language and I might use different sort of setups. But the concepts of using drawing is always useful. And I'll show you some examples if we've got time in our conversation. I've got the book right here with me. I can show your audience the sorts of things that we mean, the simple ideas that we mean, but the idea of using visual analogues works with everybody. And you might find you get working with a young person, or in fact, any age. I've used this with adults. You might use this with older adults who perhaps are finding verbal communication more difficult. Some of the concepts might work very well with lots of age groups, but of course the delivery will be slightly different. It won't be sort of wizards and fairies and, stinky things, which we talk about in primary school with such delight. But you might talk about, it in a different way. But the concepts and ideas you could roll with so many populations. I think there's lots of opportunity there.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I kind of mentioned, even as adults, one of the things I find genuinely with communication, most people, because we do it all the time, we think it's easy and we think we're good at it. And obviously Dunning-Kruger effect is most of us think we're above average at communication to some degree. And actually, most of us are terrible at it. Most of us are making a lot of assumptions every time we communicate. We're making assumptions about what we're listening to as well as what we're saying. And I like the kind of the format that you put through the book that was kind of encouraging that again, I think there's a lot of self-reflection that anybody who's doing this with a child, there's a lot of psychoeducation sort of weaved into the narrative as well, isn't there?
That's really what I felt strongly about, because I do think, look, I think we all communicate from our own position, absolutely. But communication is a skill like any other. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. You also need to practice to some degree with your partner because, particularly if you're thinking about young people in the care system, that's what, the sort of population I've got in mind that might be particularly relevant for your audience, is that, you're having to connect with a young person and there might be challenges in that. And I was very passionate about the idea of talking through using a voice in the book as if I would use to parents or carers in a clinical setting. So I'm right there in the room with you, and try this. Don't worry about that. You're going to mess up sometimes. I hope that it comes across as a sort of friendly co-worker or friendly, family member, because I think if you are in a challenging situation, one of the things we know is the skills that we do have sometimes disappear. And so we wanted to make the book atmosphere very much one of a growth mindset. You're going to mess up because we all do, but here are some things that you can learn. So the book is divided into two sections, a very brief kind of here's the best mindset for communication part. And I made a very strong decision about decanting a bunch of quite complicated literature into a very straightforward summary, because who has time to read complicated literature? I remember when my kids were smaller, I was delighted but exhausted. So the idea of reading a very complicated book of a summary of evidence, I thought is not terribly appealing, but I want to know that the evidence exists. And so that's kind of what we decanted into the first little section. It's only, I think it's about 20 pages or so. Lots of big headings, lots of icons, so you can scan down to see the bit that you might be interested in, and lots of summary about why communication is important, why you should stick at it when it feels that it's a really tough day, because the evidence is very much that if your communication skills are good, both as a carer and as a young person, your relationship will be stronger, and good relationship skills are they should be on the curriculum. They predict good mental health, good physical health, a better job, a better income. There are so many life successes that go alongside good relationship skills that really is an absolutely fundamental skill set to have. And we're not all, immediate communicators, as you said, and the book was written with that in mind, starting from a position where there may be, a lack of confidence perhaps, or somebody new to the idea of having hard conversations, and difficult conversations are ones that we need to have. And we're there metaphorically holding your hand all the way through. That's the idea. So that's the first part of it, that kind of here's the information that you need to think about, when to try and speak, when not to speak, what setting might be useful. Try and move it away from the idea of homework, because of course lots of young people will not run towards the idea of homework. And we had lots of great conversations, in fact, with the publishers, JKP, which are, they are a superb publisher. But the publisher idea was, let's call this a workbook. And we said, no, let's not call it a workbook, because that might imply there's work to be done. And we wanted to make it an invitation. So we talk about, setting up this book with some colouring pens that are only used for good fun stuff in a place that you would never do homework, underneath the kitchen table, or, in the den, or, making something different about the setting. So there's lots of little tips like that, so that you're shaping your environment and setting yourself up for success, and helping, the young person you're speaking to up for success. So we've decanted lots of good practical information, and we hope that it's, given in a really accessible way, so you can rattle through it without having to, set aside a couple of, weeks of study leave before you get going. And then the second part is the practical part. That's where we really show you how to do that. So we're talking about learning about communication in terms of content. Absolutely. What we speak about is very important. But the process is really important too. When to listen. Listening and paraphrasing back is one of the very most important key skills that will help your communication develop. And so we have lots of little prompts all the way through the practical side to remind you of the good practice, remind you to stop and listen. We've got a little icon that's got a finger on your lips. So just wait, sit with it, use your body language to listen, but don't say anything. And to try and help those that are using book to develop those communication skills in terms of process, as well as the content of what they're speaking about. So that's the idea. But shall I show you an example, seeing as we're on a visual?
Yeah, go for it.
So the second part is where we get practical. And so there are lots and lots of different conversations. And in the conversation section, you'll see there's a page there that's got lots of simple text on it. And that is set up for the adult, the person that's scaffolding the conversation. There's prompts and ideas. But it's worded in a way that if there's a very sharp little person who might want to read it as well, they can read it too. It's absolutely appropriate for them to do that. And then there is the conversation part. This is where the magic happens, right? This is where things will be said and discussed using this visual platform. And this is a very simple example, but it's quite a good one. It gives you an idea. Now, this is from the aspect of the book that wants to know how you are. How are you? And this is what we call mood mountain. So the top of the mountain is the best you've ever felt, and the bottom of the mountain is in the deep dark pit is the worst you've ever felt. And we're asking young people to put a mark to show how they feel. Now, one day they might put a mark there, and then you might say, well, tell me how you feel, how you felt yesterday. And they might put a mark there. Now, the difference between there and there is the beginning of emotional literacy. Some days I feel good, some days I feel bad. That physical difference, and this is what I'm saying about the physical, concrete capacity that drawing allows us to communicate with, is really valuable. You can say, oh, look at that, that's different. And, maybe you can start to talk about the difference and why that difference was. The other thing that happens, and we won't go through all the conversations, but, look, we've got the deep dark pit here. That is an invitation to talk about when things don't go well. And we know that sometimes carers and parents feel cautious about asking about the tough stuff. We know from the literature, and we know obviously from our personal experience, there might be a tendency to move towards talking about good stuff and positive feelings. And we also know that talking about tough stuff is very important in terms of developing our emotional literacy and ongoing mental health. So there's an invitation here. Look, it's in black and white. what was happening when you were in the deep, dark pit? And, it was the day I wasn't invited to a birthday party. It was the day I was taken into care. The content of that is important, but the point is you're inviting a conversation about the tough stuff too. And so there's lots and lots of conversations like that that cover lots of different areas. Who are you? How are you? What helps and what makes things or what gets in the way. And lots of different topics and lots of different pathways that are curated for different kids. So kids that tend to run into trouble, there's a few conversations that are particularly useful. Kids that tend to worry, I've listed a few conversations that might be useful. So I almost prescribe them, and I do this in my clinical work as well. I'll say, well, do Mood Mountain and think of a link, and then, let's talk about it. So there's lots of different conversations for lots of occasions. And nobody would be expected to go through the book all at once. But that's the concept, that's the idea. And that's what I was trying to say about, the hand-holding part. We really are right there with you. What I would say the best success would be when somebody takes out a blank sheet and writes their own template for the child, that, or the child writes it for you. That, when you go off-piste, that's when the real success has happened. Because, it's not about doing these conversations, it's about taking the ideas and running with them. And, in some ways, I hope, I would see that as enormous success if families or care systems started to use it in that way, because you can draw anything. You can start to, draw a world that makes sense to a young person and use the concepts and the ideas in that way.
So there's a few bits that you went through there that I think are really worth kind of feeding back to. One thing that I just, as you were speaking, I thought that's something that's worthwhile kind of referring back to. And I think you mentioned it, that many parents kind of try to aim towards the positive. And I think a lot of narratives out there are kind of about, stay positive, positive thinking, all that kind of stuff. And I think I even remember an audio book I listened from Anthony Robbins, who's one of the most people for positive speaking stuff. But he talks about the importance of the negative, because I think when I'm teaching around mental health, there is an element of, we tend to think of the emotions are labeled as the bad emotions, feeling sad, feeling angry, but they're all things that are helping you to understand and navigate the world, and helping children to recognize that bad emotions aren't bad. They are telling you something. They're communicating to you that something's not okay with your world, or you're not meeting your own expectations, or other people aren't meeting your expectations. And it's okay to recognize those, to understand those. And it's really important you do. It's then how you manage the behavior from those that sometimes people complain about. It's not about not having the emotions. And I thought that was really important aspect of what you were saying there.
And so we hope, just literally having these. And one of my favorite conversations is called Really Rubbish. Talk about the worst day you've ever had. And, that again, some parents are quite surprised when I say that's okay. So there's lots of communication in the content of the conversations to be had. So Andy, I think it's a really important point. We know that talking about or asking about a problem doesn't create a problem, but discussing and noticing the feeling that you have, and then perhaps acting on that way in an emotionally literate way. We're not talking about acting out, but we're noticing we're feeling sad, let down, angry, whatever. We might be articulating that in a way, and then looking at ways of potentially moving forward, moving through it, but naming it. And we do know that naming an emotion can bring the reactivity in our brain down simply by saying the emotion out loud. And somebody else can do that for us is really powerful. So I think talking about the negative, we talk about the tough stuff too. It's really important.
Yeah. I think it also allows, and maybe it's taken for granted, a validation that it's okay to feel those bad things. And when we're looking at kind of the mental health challenges that society tends to have now, and there's a stereotype, isn't there, as far as, male suicide and statistics are skewed on that to some degree or another. But as far as, because men don't talk in the same way because of years of being told, pull yourself together, be a big boy, all those kind of things. And that definitely plays a part. There's other factors massively. But encouraging children, you don't just have to be happy, that it is okay to not be okay, and be willing to express that and understand that and explore that. Because I think so many of us when it comes to adult mental health, feel that we must suppress the emotions when we're feeling bad. I can't show anybody else. And I think with things on social media and stuff, there's a danger, isn't there, that you only see the happy, you only see the perfect, you only see the perfect lives and kids kind of doing positive things. So they really need to know that everybody's experiencing this.
And I think this is, and we can model the behavior we want to see, no matter where we are in a child's life. So I think it's a really important point because sometimes, there's a curation of a perfect life, that doesn't exist anywhere, not even the person that's posting it. But the idea that we can talk about difficult emotions too, we can model that because sometimes I think there's an expectation, as a child. So tell me, share with me what's going on. Or a hope that that will happen, you have to sort of build up to that quite slowly. And one of the ways you can do that is very gently and with the appropriate boundary, share some of the difficult things that have happened in that day. Maybe you went to work and, the meeting didn't go well and you felt frustrated, but you figured it out. So, I'm not talking about sharing inappropriate, difficult emotions with a young person. But what I am saying is you can start to talk about some of the, I felt a bit jealous because a coworker got an award and I worked really hard and I wanted to be part of that as well. Some things that perhaps as adults we might not often share with young people, but with an appropriate level of boundary, it's actually very helpful because what you're saying very powerfully, we know that this is one of the most powerful ways to teach young people, is we're saying very powerfully, some emotions are difficult, even as a grown up. I have those emotions. I'm talking about it. I'm not acting it out. And I'm going to figure out a way of getting through it. All of those things are very powerfully taught by sharing at an appropriate level with young people as well as adults. So I do think we don't want to stop and be overwhelmed with any emotion. Now, whether that's a positive or negative emotion, but we do want to talk about the full rainbow of experiences. It's absolutely, it's a really good point, Andy. Yeah.
I think as well, just to add on to that, and then there's a few other bits that you mentioned that I really want to kind of touch on. One of the things that I try and get over is that because children can be quite vulnerable for experiencing or interpreting situations negatively and centralistically. So I always use the example of when I first started teaching, see somebody yawn and I must be boring them. And children can be particularly susceptible and vulnerable of that because they don't have that same ability to empathize, put themselves in somebody else's shoes, experience the world. So grumpy parent may be a case of I've done something wrong, they're not happy with me. So getting in the habit of being explicit, of going, do you know what, I've had a really tough day today and I'm just finding it a bit hard. I'm going to do this to make myself feel better. Not only does it role model, as you mentioned there, it also explicitly lets the child know this isn't about you. It isn't, I'm not angry at you. It's okay to feel angry and it's not necessarily directed towards anybody, especially within those who are in looked after situations, that their previous experiences of negative parental emotions have often then led to bad things. So it's so important to be explicit in those particular circumstances. Adding on, isn't it?
I do some social skills training with young people who are autistic. And actually, I often say that the skills that we discuss in those settings could be beneficial for everybody. So, I know I'm frowning right now. It's because I'm thinking about a really hard problem or, as you say, a hard day at work or whatever. Being explicit about, why your facial expression might be arranged in the way it is really important.
Mm.
And it helps, starting conversations in lots of ways. Because the next time you see, a young person, looking upset or, having a particular, looking frowning, you might say, oh, that looks like you've got, you might have something on your mind. I wonder what's going on. And you're starting to share some experiences in that way. I think it's, I think being explicit about how you're feeling is an excellent sort of emotional literacy
Mm.
way of being just day to day, particularly as you say for children and children on the younger end of that area. But also if we're thinking about teenagers, actually, interestingly, teenagers' brains are tuned to think about non-verbal cues. So your tone of voice and your
Mm.
facial expression, for lots of
Yeah.
reasons because of their stage of development, is it's as if the volume is turned up on that. So if you're frowning and your tone of voice is saying, I'm very pleased with you, your young person might not hear the content of your words, but may well pick up on your facial expression. So for lots of reasons, I think it's a really good tip.
Yeah, yeah. And I think people, there's a massive, we won't go into too much on we'll do another one on the teenage brain, because I think there's so many people out there who could really benefit going, oh, it's the hormones. Oh, you've got no idea. You've got no idea of what's going on in their brains, the full pruning away of the old, and changes in your neurotransmitters and stuff like that are going on. So yeah, we'll do that another time, or with
Another
Bettina or something like that. I wanted to touch on there's a couple of bits in the stage one, or the part one of the book, that kind of I thought were important, and I just wanted to refer to. One of them, I really like the fact that you encouraged and you explicitly mentioned that both parents, or if it is a two-parent household, or for whatever the circumstances, but it shouldn't just be whoever's supporting and helping that child should both be party to this. And I think there is a bit of a habit, isn't there, that stereotypically, maybe it's a generalization, but definitely traditionally, one part of the parenting household has more time with the child and therefore engages in more communication, more emotional literacy, as you mentioned there. And then there's sometimes this other parent who's working very, very hard, highly stressed, that doesn't have those opportunities. And I think when we're talking about role modeling, if we do have a two-parent household, and it is, let's say, male-female, that both are representing certain role models, but even if it is a same-sex relationship or anything, they're both sort of representing certain characteristics, certain actions, that this is what emotional literacy isn't just something that a mother or the typical mothering role does, but also the paternal or the typical paternal role should. I'm trying to kind of keep as inclusive as I can in that language there, but to try and make sure that both parties should be engaging it, I think was really just something, a lovely point that you drew attention to there.
And I think that, if you have somebody that may be a young person who doesn't, it doesn't gravitate towards the idea of communication, actually swapping roles and saying, let's talk about, what happened in your day to day, as the parent that's not usually that, the CEO of emotional literacy, the other one, the CFO or whatever. So that's really novel and interesting, and I might really grab the child's interest in a way that could be very interesting. And we hope that the book is set up in such a way that there's such a lot of scaffolding in it. If you don't feel comfortable, or it's not your first instinct to have a heart-to-heart conversation or a big conversation about how things went, or how you're feeling, there's enough in there. There's enough support in there to give you, I'm not going to use the word script, but to give you ideas of things you can say and know that it's all right, and just opening the book and getting the colouring pens out, that's amazing, right? That's a great start, and you can pick up and roll with it, gradually. So I'm so glad, Andy, that you picked that up, because it was one of the things that we hoped, would land well. So I'm glad you picked up.
Thank you for listening to the Able to Care podcast. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, comment, and share. We really appreciate all of you listeners. I'm going to refer to the 4 compass points that you've got within the book, which kind of outline the 4 main areas. And you've already mentioned one, I think was in the Cliff one who described it there, but that's in the how are you section. So you got the 4 sections: the who are you, the how are you, the what helps, and what gets in your way. So would you mind just kind of explaining, why did you decide to go on those 4 areas, and what are the importance of each of them?
I mean, the first one, who are you, might sound an odd question, particularly for thinking about, young people in biological families. You might have known that young person, for many years, and in fact have a sense of who they are from before they were born. But actually, my experience is, you would be surprised how infrequently carers and parents ask questions of their young person. Like, what was the best day you've ever had? What was the worst day you ever had? What, if we could do anything in the world, what would you do? One of the conversations is called My Best Day, and you can just go with it. It's a fantasy. You don't have to tell them off. You don't have to come off screens. You don't have to get up, or, you can really have fun together. And these are really simple questions. In fact, one of the things that I struggled with as I was writing the book, saying, is this too simple? And I really had to, am I stating something that's obvious? And then, we know from experience, we know from the literature, we know from, our own family lives, simple ideas are the best ones. Now, the reason that you want to think about, who are you, is you're asking questions that allow you to get inside that young person's ideas, a favorite memory, and really get them to go for that memory. What could I smell? What could I hear? What was underneath my feet? Those sensory experiences that you're sharing together are a really important way of bonding. So asking the question who you are, and asking that regularly, because that's going to change. That doesn't, stay the same as in a 5-year-old as a 10-year-old. So that was really important, getting to know that young person. The other sort of aspect of the compass is the how are you? So sort of that really is drilling down into emotional literacy. The emotions that I'm feeling, the good, the bad and the ugly, all of those emotions that are around, and learning how to articulate them and learning how to share in them. So that's the sort of second aspect of it. The third and fourth parts of that compass are thinking about the resources that you have when things are tough. So what helps me when I am struggling? So for example, there's a conversation about support squad. It's literally like a cheerleader squad in a triangle, or a pyramid rather. And it's really thinking about asking the young person to articulate the people that are around them. And that might be people that are no longer living with them. It might be people that have died. It might be cuddly toys. All of these things we know form attachments and can be soothing objects and can bring our stress levels down. Even if we have somebody in mind that is no longer in our life, it brings our stress levels down. So literally counting through the people in your life that you would consider your support squad is really important. So it's thinking about the things that help me when times are tough. And the final one is what gets in the way. So what is happening that is just tripping me up now and again, or routinely. So for example, I've got one called the oops loops, things that every now and again I'm routinely running into difficulty because of that. Now, what might be underneath that? Or spoiler alert, which is a really classic one about drawing if you have a young person that's tending towards having meltdowns, you might ask the young person to draw the meltdown and name it. And then you have the capacity in their system or their school or their family, who's going to spot the meltdown coming through the door. If you call your meltdown red rage, who spots red rage first? So you're asking that young person to articulate it using the different platforms here. So, we are talking about the barriers and the strategies essentially in the final two parts of the book, and asking the family to think about what those strategies are and what helps. And it's usually social support, and also thinking about what gets in the way. And right at the end of the book, we talk about some ways that you might get rid of some of the barriers, but that's right at the end of the book. And it may be something that families come on to, but it may be something that they don't come on quite yet, because it's a sort of final page of, pulling together all your resources. But that's the idea. There's not a sense that you would go through it necessarily in logical order, or indeed use every one of the conversations. There's a little description about each of the conversations, so you can pick and choose. Or you can, I call it pick and mix. So you turn around and you can be, as an adult, you can be the one that, talking through and answering questions and drawing. Or it could be that you use one of the pathways I described, depending on, there's some starter ones, there's some more advanced ones, there's ones for kids that tend to worry and so on. So the hope is, there's a selection box there, and you take your favorites and leave the ones that you don't fancy, leave the coffee in the selection box, and take the good stuff.
Coconut for me.
The Christmas. And so that's the plan, so there's no sort of sense of having to work through it in a sequential way, but it is set up. If that works, it will do well.
Yeah, I like the, I think I mentioned when I sent some stuff over to you that I really like, there was I think it's one of the appendices, isn't it, where you've put down this kind of step by step. It's a particular route that you could take through the book based on where you feel you are within the journey. And I thought that was quite a nice little tool at the back of the book there to kind of, for somebody who's coming along going, I don't even know where to start with this. Sometimes people do need, as you said, you use the metaphor there of holding their hand to guide them through the process. And I think that was a nice little tool at the back of the book there that kind of, that added to that. And as you said, some for specific needs that your child may be experiencing at that particular time as well. If the emotional dysregulation is particular for them, then that's something that's in there. So I kind of broke it down into like the identity one. I agree with you. It's we take for granted our identity, but I think there's so many children out there, especially currently, that they don't necessarily have a clear sense of identity. I mean, we don't anyway as children to some degree, do we? But as you said, it's constantly changing, and which means that the book is always going to be relevant to that. My best day today might be different from what I perceive as my best day tomorrow. There's one of the activities that I pulled out from that section that I liked, which was the wishful thinking, was one that I quite liked. I am a big fan and advocate of solution focused therapy and things like that. So I love to kind of always look at, so miracle day, for instance, is, if I woke up tomorrow and everything that had happened. So it reminded me of that a little bit. But when I kind of read through it, I noticed it kind of stipulated that it doesn't need to be the big long-term goals in life. If I want to be this, that, and the other, it could be the fact that I just want sausages for tea tomorrow. And if all your child is worrying about is sausages for tea tomorrow, we're golden.
Exactly right. And it tells you, what the emotional temperature is. Even if there's a young person or a child that does potentially have some quite major obstacles or experiences in their environment, if that's what they're asking for or thinking about, then that is exactly right. That's a very good, it's like dipping your toe in their emotional, in the emotional waters, because that sounds like there's something quite interesting, in terms of it's quite low level there. Or wishing something doesn't happen, I always think is very interesting. I wish that, my brother doesn't get into trouble. That's an interesting one. I think the wishful thinking on the face of it can be really good fun, but it can also be, very revealing, as all these conversations might be. But yeah, it's you can ask the child to choose one. That's also very interesting. Is there something that and you can just go pick one, and giving them that power and that agency can sometimes be really useful and really interesting.
Well, so I believe all of the activities, because obviously on each of the, each in the stage 2 or the part 2 of the book, you've already kind of mentioned, you showed the middle pages there, didn't you? So it's broken typically into 4 pages. The first one gives a bit of a summary of what the exercise is all about. Then you've got kind of your conversation starters and your kind of tips of how to keep the conversation going. And then you've got the actual activity itself. And then you've got a bit of reflection afterwards of how it went, how it worked. But I think there's a link where you can actually then get additional copies of the activity bit. Have I got that right? Yeah.
That's right. You have it's a promise for an endless supply of these materials. So if you've bought the book, you can go and, print out as many of it's a PDF file and as many as you wish. And I think that, if you're thinking about young people who, I think this is a wonderful resource. Of course, I would say this, wouldn't I? But, it's the sort of thing that I wished I had done with my kids, is keep all these drawings and ideas in one place. I wish that I had. And so there's a bit of, wishful thinking from my point of view, because actually keeping everything together in this book is such a, it can be used as part of life story work. Of course it could be, but it is such a wonderful way of describing this was who I was at that point in time. And of course, these young people develop and change, and that's one of the wonderful things about working with young people. You can be witness to that. But the idea that the PDFs will keep coming and you can make, pile after pile after pile. If there's one conversation that sits really well with the needs of that young person, you can do that 1,000 times and you can look at it over and over again. So, I mean, we were really pleased that the publishers agreed to do that, because it was I think that's really, really important. kind of add on, and it shows that it is a work in progress. You don't just complete them and that's it. This is not about completing a workbook. This is about learning a process and learning how to evolve your skills depending on the demands of the situation.
It kind of gives us the metaphors or as you say, using it as a toolkit rather than the example you showed in the book there is where are they on that cliff? That's something they might want to color in, they might want to draw, they might want to express it, and giving the colors behind it, might help them to, as an add-on, as you said, thinking outside the box. So because we're here, let's paint it in this color, or why don't you choose a color that you think represents that? But then they can go back to it. So even on a week, they could kind of see, how's your week improved? How's it going up? How's it going down? Which is a wonderful reference for any child going, the highs and the lows. And yeah.
And that's what life is, and you've literally got it. I think there's a conversation, I can't remember quite what it's called, but it's about giving every day of the week, giving a picture or a number to it. Just doing that, it's sort of like, the beginnings of journaling. But just noticing that some days are better than others. And even if it's by a smidge, that's the chink of light, because that's noticing that, that this day was slightly better. A child's going through a tough time. Give it marks out of 10, and every day is 1 out of 10, but that day was 2 out of 10. Well, okay, so here we have what happened that was different on the 2 out of 10 day. Now, that's not an easy read to look through that with a young person, but the point is, the experience for that young person is they've noticed something is slightly better, and that emotional literacy is, that's the gold dust.
I suppose for rather than biological parents as well, looking at foster parents or children's home workers, support workers, activities like this, when we're looking at kind of exploring emotions, where we're looking at identity and understanding, these are all tools that can help to build trust as well with the child themselves, because they are quite nurturing in nature. There's a high level of, obviously, I should imagine there's an intensity to them. So obviously it has to be, as you said, and that's a quite nice thing. It could be put down. We can come back to it later. Don't worry if this is too much. Whereas a conversation kind of has to kind of flow to its natural end sometimes. Have you, obviously, the book's been out for a little while now, hasn't it? So but you've been using these tools for ages anyway, I should imagine, and training parents and caregivers in these kind of strategies. What kind of effects have you found, or have you had some feedback on the book itself that people are utilizing this?
And it's one of my favorite parts about this book is the feedback has been really quite extraordinary. And sometimes it can be something quite inane. So I'll give you an example of some families in which perhaps communication wasn't really the issue. Perhaps there was something else I was working with. And the fact that they started to think about the power of communication in those families, they've been using the ideas and saying, I've discovered that my young person or my child wants to be, a painter, or I didn't know that. I feel like I understand some of the things, that are going through their mind in a way that I never have before. Lots and lots of parenting groups use this book as a way of jumping to something that's not digital. Now, the screen, I'm not, one of the challenges of our life and one of the gifts of our, point in life is, digital experiences. So I'm not anti-digital experiences at all. I think there's lots of wonderful things that it can offer. But the great thing is lots of families have told me about being able to pick it up because it's completely old school and analog, right? There's no digital devices needed. And being, I have to say, I feel very delighted, but being so grateful about that as a chance to do something different, slightly novel. I don't have to think of anything. It's 4:00, it's raining. I can't think of anything else to do. Oh, I know. Let's have a look at the book. So both in terms of understanding and connecting with young people that, when communication has been vulnerable, in terms of the mundane, and I use that word in terms of the mundane nature of having to learn these communication skills and really appreciating that, getting that feedback. But I think also the idea of, it is a thing, every parent or carer or support worker will say, you can talk to me about anything. They will say that and they mean it, but they don't quite know how to put it into action. And what the book does is it allows them and gives them the ideas. It gives them the script and the prompts that mean that that conversation can happen. They can literally talk the talk and walk the walk. And so that opportunity is great. But as I say, perhaps the best feedback I have ever had is when families say, when we're having a conversation, we get the paper and the pens out. So that tells me they've generalized the ideas and the skills from that book. And nothing makes me happier than the idea that they have, if you like, internalized the processes. Everybody's got something from the idea of using drawing as a way of augmenting a conversation. And that's wonderful. You can draw the football team, you can make it the West Ham team, and you can start to use, that as the interesting thing. You can use a meme or, it doesn't matter what it is, you can create anything in that drawing, and that allows the young person to engage. So I think that's the part that makes me most excited. But I have to say, I get lots of lovely feedback, both from families and from, as I say, parenting groups that have used it as well. Lots of good stuff. So I try and, it's good.
I just thought, from what you said there, well, one, it's fantastic that you're really getting that positive feedback, and that's what I think any person who does anything like what we do is kind of looking desperately for, is actually making a difference and improving the quality of people's lives, isn't it? So it's a case of that little feedback is, oh yeah, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. There was something I just thought there as an add-on that's to the getting the pens and paper out. There's actually a shift in mentality of a habit that I think a lot of parents and caregivers would have, that they think that a conversation needs to be this intense experience between, eye contact to eye contact, look at me when I'm talking to you, kind of is conversation. And I think we take for granted, I know from experience that sometimes, like the car is a prime example where many disclosures happen in the car between a child and an adult, because it's a place that they're trapped in this place together. So it is just this co-connection, but it's also a lower intensity of this face-to-face. Like many couples resolve arguments in the car or in bed, and bed isn't why people think. But they're two situations where we're not in this intense situation. We're looking forwards. We're not looking at each other. So actually having that, hey, we're both drawing, we're both co-connecting by doing a similar activity or engaging with this, but it allows that we usually be side to side with each other rather than necessarily, just as face to face. There's a potential barrier of paper and pens in front that make me feel safer. Is that something that's played into what you do generally? Is that why you kind of added that in with the parents as well?
I mean, it really does take the intensity out. It absolutely does. And you can start to think about, I often say you don't even need a paper and pen. You can use, the sand in the sand pit. If you need to do a mood mountain, say, where do you feel right now? You can draw that in the sand, and you're using the visual ideas and the concrete communication capacity for these young people everywhere. The other thing that I think is worth coming back to is the idea of having a sort of signal, a non-verbal signal. That makes it sound fancy, and it doesn't need to be, to say we've finished. We've had an incredible conversation. Now, I in the book, I suggest a fist bump, right? We've just had an incredible conversation is my idea. But the best ones will be the ones that family systems or, come up with themselves. Now, the reason that is really valuable is that I don't have to expend any energy in thinking about it. It's nonverbal. And so if you say to your kid, do you want to do, a conversation? Should we draw that out? And they say, no, thank you. It's not a good time. You can reward that with a fist bump, because that is an emotionally literate way of saying, I'm just not ready to talk right now. And you want to reward that with the idea that it was a communication that deserves applause, and you are so proud of that, right? So that's one of the things, you can lift and lay these conversations. They don't have to be, 10 minutes long. They can even not happen at all. And that is a beautiful way of communicating. You're learning those skills and saying, just not now. If your kid says, no, I don't want to talk right now, I would reward that, I would jump up and down with a fist bump, say, that's incredible. Because we are learning those communication skills. Of course, I would come back to it, and think about, when the time is right and so on. But the intensity of communication, that's one of the things that we're learning as the adults supporting a young person, can be too much, and it might be too much to articulate. But being able to convey that in an appropriate way is a wonderful communication skill. And then there might be a time where you pick up a little, maybe it's in the car, maybe it's going for a walk, and these journeys always come to an end, so the energy changes. It's a really good tip to do that. So whether you're drawing, whether you're walking, doing an activity that goes alongside is always a good tip. And even it doesn't have to be drawing, although of course you can tell it's one of my passions. But I know lots of different activity. Washing the dishes, walking the dog, gaming, doesn't matter. Conversation with something else to sit in when it gets a bit tough, and you can sit back out of it when you need to, is a really good tip.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Very much for me personally, I find even as an adult, there's things there that I think should be okay to do. I find it easier to have the telly on in the background when I have social situations, because it just takes the pressure away from having to find the things to say. Because even if something's on the TV, it gives us something to say. It's the same premise.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I think was so important about what you said, that adults should be taking on board as well. One of the hardest things that I've had to learn over my life, and done a lot of therapy and psychoeducation to help me to do that, is recognizing my own boundaries and feeling comfortable enough to say that I need some more time for that, or I'm not okay to do that right now. And that is a trait that we learn in childhood, that it's okay to say no, that I don't feel comfortable with this. Can I come back to it later? So I think that's a lovely and really important point, and nobody should kind of just gloss over that without taking a little bit of mindfulness towards it. That, the fist bump and rewarding that child for saying no is actually huge. And I always try and get over to caregivers and families. I've raised my son to know that no is a really good and powerful word. Because when I'm not there to hold his hand anymore and other people are trying to coerce him, I wanted him to feel safe and okay and justified to say no. But that's sometimes when parents don't like the no, because no's are painful, and therefore, you're being disobedient, you're being, resistant, defiant, whatever it is. But it might just be they're expressing their boundaries, and celebration of that is sometimes the right and appropriate thing, isn't it?
And getting towards saying no, an appropriate, gentle tone, for example. No, thank you. Could we do it later? Would be, the sort of gold dust, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But the idea of saying it, articulating the words rather than running off or kicking, or acting out that feeling of not wanting to engage, is a thing that you could start to reward with a fist bump or whatever, because you're saying, I like that you've said it, and you've been able to articulate it rather than describe it with your actions. So that is a really, that's where the chance to reward that emotional regulation is there. So I mean, and finding your, whatever your signal is, a thumbs up or whatever, it doesn't matter. It can be quite good fun, but get your kid to come up with it, because that's always going to be more powerful.
Well, so as we're drawing to an end then, I think I've loved chatting to you, and I genuinely would love to have you back and explore the teenage brain and go into a little bit of depth on that, because I do find it fascinating. I find adolescence fascinating. It's been a long time since I was one, so maybe that's why I feel so fascinated by it. Do you have like kind of a favorite out of all of the conversations that are in the book? Have you got one particular one? You've mentioned a few already, but have you got any that are your particular favorite?
I have to say, the one that I think you have most fun with is probably memory frame game, and you go back to your favorite memory and you use all your senses. That's so interesting to find out what your kids, what your kid thought of or remembered. And with kids who've been in the care system, been looked after, it's also very interesting intellectually. I have to say, the other thing that I really enjoy watching, and I do this very often with young people too, is to mix it up. And so that I might take a turn. So they ask me a question. That's always so, they always think that's so funny. And, there's lots of giggles with that because, asking about my memory, what's my favorite memory? Oh gosh, it's so long ago. That sort of experience is all, they find that quite, sort of, I suppose, peculiar, the idea, but the idea of the driving seat, sometimes I think that, and obviously it's appropriate in terms of professional boundaries and so on, but that can be really good fun. I'm never happier, Andy, when lying on the floor with some colouring pens talking about, whatever's on a young person's mind. That's my happy spot. So I have to say, I really do enjoy it. And I would, and also talking about the tough stuff. I always learn something working with young people and drawing through and talking through whatever content that is. I find it enormously rewarding. So I'd find it hard to pick one in particular. There's so many, Andy.
I thought I'd put you on the spot there a little bit. I really enjoyed the book. I think it is a great little tool. It is going to be on my bookshelf, and I will refer to it and pull it out and definitely recommend it to others. So thank you so much for joining us and talking about it. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've definitely picked up a few bits there that have sparked my kind of brain to go in slightly different directions from it. So that's amazing. So obviously we will put a link to your book.
What I was going to say is, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I do little videos using the book. So I do sort of, as if I'm drawing the book, I'm drawing using the conversations in the book, and they're on my Instagram feed. You'll be able to see them. They're ones with, there's a still with a pen in the hand, and those are ways of introducing some of the conversations and some little tips. If anybody wants to use us as a starter place, it's on Instagram. I put all these little videos on Instagram.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, what we'll do is I'll make sure we put the link to your Instagram in the show notes and the description on the YouTube channel. We'll put also a link to the book as well, so people can go directly to it and find it easily. And you've got a website as well, so I'll make sure we kind of link that in as well, so people can find a bit more about you, and obviously probably reach out if they've got any questions or anything like that.
Delighted.
But yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and it was and I look forward to having a conversation again in the future.
What a delight, Andy. Thank you for having me.
So if you found today's episode useful and enjoyable, please like, share, and comment. I think there's some great stuff in there that any parent or caregiver of children particularly, but even looking through the book, I think there's people who could use this even in the adult and elderly care sector. There is loads of little resources in there that could genuinely open up some amazing conversations. So those of you who are looking after a loved one with dementia and don't know how to have a conversation, pick out that book. I think there would be some genuine and great things to do the life story work and have a chat about emotional stuff and getting a little bit deeper. I wish I'd had that as far as like my grand's concerned, to kind of talk about and learn about some of her life history and her feelings and thoughts. Some of the topics may or may not be relevant, but I think it's very much applicable to all. So thank you very much, Jane, and see you all next time. Thank you.